So I think of the metaverse as the next generation of the internet. So you can kind of think about it as, instead of being an internet that we look at, it's an internet that we are a part of, or that we can be inside of.
Think films like Ready Player One, where the idea of a metaverse went by a different name.
Except for eating, sleeping, and bathroom breaks, whatever people want to do, they do it in the Oasis.
I always wanted to help build this kind of immersive system that you could be in with your friends and feel like you were present together, but go explore, other planets or other periods of time, or, play games together, but feel like you were really in it together.
Zuckerberg talked with me a lot about digital payments, creating virtual goods, using cryptocurrencies, empowering creators and artists, creating virtual performance spaces. So if he has his way, this metaverse is going to enable essentially an entire economy.
The definition of the metaverse is a collective virtual shared space created by the convergence of virtually enhanced physical reality and physically persistent virtual space, including the sum of all virtual worlds, augmented reality, and the internet.
Here's the thing, and here's the thing I'm going to show you this morning. People are already demanding this. People have been wanting this for years and for decades. Go anywhere today and look around. You will see people stuck in their phones. They will have a screen in front of their face. This is what people want. People are already doing this. Pop culture is already defining this. There's been several science fiction movies over the last 20 or 30 years that kind of speak to this type of environment where there's a virtual world somewhere. There was a book written in 2011 called Ready Player One. That is, I didn't read the book, and I guess it was a movie. I haven't seen the movie, but I've read enough about the plot and the storyline. Basically, people, they live inside this game. Their life is spent inside this game. The world around them is this terrible kind of post-apocalyptic world, and everyone lives and works and spends time inside this game. They get money from the game, and then if they lose all their money, or if they die, they lose all their money, and then this corporation owns them or something like that. But it's basically people that are living the real world inside a virtual world. So pop culture has this stuff going on in it, in movies and all that type of thing. So do people want it, is the question that we're looking at this morning. In order to really understand how serious this is, I need to take you back to the 80s. Okay, now if you're over 40, you're going to know what I'm talking about. If you're not over 40, you're probably not going to know what I'm talking about. I can already see, I've even mentioned it, and I can already see heads nodding. But in 1974, something was invented. And there was this game that was invented in 1974, and the game was called Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, the game was called Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I was a church kid. I mean, I grew up Lutheran, and we all know, I'm not going to get into that, but I was always in church as a kid, and all my friends were in church, and this was a huge deal in the 1980s. The idea of this role-playing game called Dungeons and Dragons. Mind you, this was a board game. How many people have heard of Dungeons and Dragons? Okay, this was a board game, like you roll dice and play this game. Let me just give you a Wikipedia paragraph about Dungeons and Dragons. At various times in history, Dungeons and Dragons has received negative publicity for alleged promotion of Satanism, witchcraft, suicide, pornography, and murder. The moral panic or feeling of fear spread among people that some evil threatens the among some people that this evil threatens the well-being of society around role-playing games peaked between 1988 and 1992. Now, I can tell you from experience, I was in junior high and going into high school during this 1988 to 1992, and this was a huge deal. This was up there with Ouija boards. You don't touch this game. Kids at school were playing this game, and we're just like all the kids that went to church in the school, which was the majority of the kids, by the way, just for the record back then. You're like, what? Yeah, most kids went to church. They were Catholic or Lutheran in my areas, but at least they were in church, and they were warned about things like this, these demonic things that, they portrayed demonic things. Now what was happening is people were playing the game, but then they started like acting out the game in real life. Because it was the first introduction of a role-playing game where you actually became the character yourself. It's not like a sorry board where you were just kind of this thing going across a board. You were actually building a character and living this life on this board game. Well, people were taking it too seriously, and they were starting to have little groups and clubs. There was people that were killed. There was people that killed themselves. I mean, all kinds of weird stories if you look up. Probably don't look it up. But basically, Dungeons and Dragons was a dark thing, and Christians across the country were extremely worried about it. Now, let me read you the end of this Wikipedia article where it says in 2016, basically Christians in the United States were freaking out about this game. In 2016, the New York Times reported that the moral panic over Dungeons and Dragons had subsided. So basically it just kind of became not a big deal. But here's the thing, it's not that Dungeons and Dragons, the game, or things like it ended. Or it's not like they got better. It's just that people got desensitized to it. And then it moved on to video games. This was just, mind you, this was a board game. You literally took dice and rolled the dice and moved a character across a board, and there was some kind of story attached to it. It was just a board game. But then it moved on to video games. I have personal experience. When I first started my career in 2000, there were several men at the company that I worked at that were involved in this role-playing video game called EverQuest. And what these guys were doing is they were literally, it was the strangest thing to me, they were staying up all night playing this game. These guys would come to work and say, I didn't even go to bed last night. And these guys were spending hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars buying like a top hat for their character on eBay, and just to make their wizard more powerful, or things like that. Look, this was in 2000. This was 21 years ago. Turn to Leviticus chapter 27. Like I said, the Bible doctrine attached to this whole topic this morning is not complicated. But you may be surprised at how far along this path that we actually are in this country. These guys they were spending all their time, these were married men, some of them with children. Several of them now are divorced, by the way. Not saying that the game itself caused that, but the point is that they were living in this game to the detriment of their families and to the detriment of their jobs. We could see it at work. The boss of the group, my boss was part of this. It was the craziest thing. You laugh, but here's the thing. This is just the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game getting more and more vivid as we move through time. Look at Leviticus chapter 27, or chapter 20 and verse 27. The Bible says, a man also or woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, their blood shall be upon them. Look, this is how serious God takes witchcraft. Now we have people that they're not just playing a game, they're role-playing as a wizard, as a witch, and they're wanting to be warlocks. They're wanting to be these powerful, people that can use magic. Look, it is a common theme. Magic and witchcraft is a common theme in many video games today. And look, what I'm trying to get at is in the 1980s and the 1990s, this used to be a big deal. This used to be a big problem. You have to ask yourself, why not just knights? Why not just horses and knights and battles? That's cool. Why not just, like a warfare game or whatever? Why does it always have to be witchcraft? Have you ever asked yourself that? I'll explain more on this later. But to recap, my assessment of the metaverse, of the invention of it, is yes, it's possible. And companies today can find the resources to build it, and they're going to. And guess what? People will beg for it. People crave it. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Let's talk for a few minutes more about this idea of gaming. Because I've heard sermons about gaming before, and most times that people preach a sermon on gaming or video games, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse number 11 that is the key verse. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse number 11. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse number 11. The Bible says this. It says, when I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. So this is a verse that's saying, hey, when you become a man, quit playing video games. What I want to show you this morning is this is much more serious than just childish things. These are not childish things that are happening here. And that's why you're seeing adults get into this stuff. Look, it is much more serious than this. Even the simplest games, seemingly harmless games, promote things like suicide. Did you know that? I used to play, like when I'd go to a friend's house, because guess what? When I was growing up, if you had a Nintendo, you were rich. Like only the rich kids had Nintendo. So if I ever got to go over to somebody's house and play Nintendo, we played Mario, the little cartoon guy. Well, guess what? When you didn't get to the level that you wanted, or you missed something and you didn't get the score you wanted, well, you just jump off a cliff. You just kill yourself. And it's a funny thing, right? I mean, it's just a cartoon guy. Like, or whatever. You just die. But here's the thing. Guess what? That's a cartoon guy. Now take that same philosophy to a war game with the graphics of what we have today. The graphics are getting more and more real every single year. Now those graphics, now you look like a real person that's killing yourself or killing your buddy or whatever. We'll get to that in a minute. But now, by the way, now the graphics are so real, let's talk about pornography and lust. These are all the same things that people were worried about Dungeons and Dragons causing in the 1980s. Look now. I mean, just the promotion of pornography, the characters in these games, it's used for sales. It's used to get people to buy these games. Young men, it's just desensitizing. Let's talk about violence. Talk about violence. Look, these super real killing simulations in these modern, even simple games. Let me just give you a quote from a man named David Grossman. David Grossman was a man who, he's a former U.S. Army Ranger and West Point psychologist. And he wrote 2 books. One is called On Killing and one is called On Combat. And these books are about the psychology of war. They're about the psychology of war. They're about this problem. I'll read you his quote in a minute, but it's this problem that when you have a person, see, in World War II, the United States had a problem. They took all these farm kids and these rural kids and they sent them off to war. And when they got in war, they wouldn't shoot anybody. Because guess what? Most normal people, when they put a person in front of them, they don't want to kill that person. So the U.S. Army found ways around this through training. Let me read you a quote from David Grossman. He said, "We found in World War II, most of our troops wouldn't pull the trigger. It was like 90% of troops would not shoot the first time. They would either try to miss because they just had this natural aversion. Where do you think that comes from? Romans 2:15. That's where that comes from. That comes from the law that God wrote in your heart that, you know what? Don't kill people. Don't murder people. We found out in World War II that most of our troops wouldn't pull the trigger," he said. "The reason was that they were trained to shoot at bullseyes and they had a natural aversion for killing. The majority failed on the battlefield because there were no bullseyes on the battlefield. It was a lack of proper training," he continues. "Under stress and extreme state of fear and giving everything that happened on the front, they couldn't shoot, especially how they were raised, that natural aversion that they had." He says training methods were then changed and became more effective, as did psychological preparations for combat. What Grossman calls killing simulators were developed. Rather than shooting at bullseyes, targets were human silhouettes, shot at using M16-like game controllers. The simulators brought the desired results, and computer games became very interesting to the United States military. Similar video games have reached the public and have been unregulated in their availability to children, Grossman said. In fact, he said in a court battle that ultimately was heard by the Supreme Court, video game manufacturing companies argued that they are protected under the First Amendment. The media, therefore, he said, censors anything that deflects blame for school violence back on themselves, and parents do not want to let go of their babysitters. More on that later. It's interesting, I'll just say this, it's interesting that the First Amendment works for filth and violence, but not for church, but we won't go into that one. But look, he also relates the success of the U.S. military. So the U.S. military solved this problem. And then, after Vietnam and future wars, came this problem that they had of post-traumatic stress disorder. So they solved the problem of getting people to just kill or shoot on the first time, but they got another problem out of that. Turn to Ephesians chapter 4. Here's the real problem, and the Bible defines this for us. Here's the real problem with these video games, and not just violence, but all the things that they portray. Look at Ephesians chapter 4. It's much more serious than just putting away childish things. And I'll show you. And you say, the Bible must talk about it then. It does. Look at Ephesians chapter 4 and verse number 17. This is why you must know the Bible. This is why you must read the Bible. You must be able to read the Bible and know it so well that when you see things in the world, you say, oh yeah, that's what this is. The Bible talks about this in Ephesians chapter 4. Look at verse 17. I'm not trying to depress you this morning, but I kind of am. Look at verse 17. This I say, therefore, is talking about maturing as a Christian in Ephesians chapter 4. Becoming mature as a Christian. This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind. Having, now underline these three words, the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. And then underline these two words, who being past feeling, have given themselves over to lasciviousness and work all uncleanness with greediness. It says in verse 19, it says that these people have had their understanding. Like they understood, but that understanding was darkened, it was dimmed. Meaning their understanding is less crisp, it's less sharp now. And then look at verse number 19. Look, verse number 19 says you can literally get past feeling. It says, who being past feeling, meaning you can cover up your conscience. You can scar, look folks, Romans 2:15 talks about the law written in your heart, your conscience, that God gave you. Look, you can damage that. You can scar that, you can cover it up, you can darken it. You can get past it, the Bible is saying. Quite simply, where these things, violence, pornography, lust, all these different things, they just don't bother you anymore. They're just not, you just see it again and again. So how? How does that happen? Go to Romans chapter 7. You know how it happens? By exposure to it. Again and again and again. That's what the U.S. military did. They exposed them to more real situations and they desensitized them to it. So then that was the training that they would follow when they got in those situations. Now go to Romans chapter 7. On the contrary, this is what the Bible says we should do. So the Bible here is saying in Ephesians chapter 4 that you can darken your understanding. You can move past. Look, I have this feeling that says that's wrong. Violence is wrong. Pornography is wrong. All these things are wrong. When I see that, I'm like, whoa, that's wrong. But the Bible says I can get past that. If I just keep exposing myself to these things over and over, I can get past that. I can get past that conscience. But on the contrary, the Bible says we should do this. Look at Romans 7 and verse 13. Was then that which is good made death unto me? He's talking about the law here. He says, what about the law? What is it? He says, but sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. This is what the Bible's for. This is what the commandment is for. You know the Bible, you read the Bible, you get in the Bible, and sin by the commandment, the law, the Bible, will become exceedingly sinful to you. It will jump out at you. You will see sin, and you'll say, whoa, I don't want anything to do with that. It will just pop out in your face. These games are doing exactly the opposite. They're doing exactly what everyone was worried about in the 1980s with Dungeons and Dragons. They're desensitizing the population to Satanism, witchcraft, suicide, pornography, and murder. That's what they're doing. Thinking about, look, even me, I'm thinking about Dungeons and Dragons as I'm writing this sermon, as I'm studying for this sermon, and I'm just like, it seems so harmless compared to what we're seeing now, because we've been desensitized to it. But look, it was an outrage in the 1980s. It was an outrage. But guess what? The depictions in these now video games, these now role-playing games, have now, the depictions of the Satanism, the witchcraft, the suicide, the pornography, and the murder and the killing have gotten only more real today. They're more graphic. They're more in your face. And guess what? The outrage is dying because our understanding has been darkened. That's why the outrage is dying. The outrage didn't die because the games got better. It's much, much worse than it ever was. We have moved. Look, we have moved, as Ephesians chapter 4 says. I hope you underlined those 6 words. We have moved past feeling in this country. When you see these things and you see these games, turn to Job chapter 24. Turn to Job chapter 24. We have moved past feeling. Here's another thing. Here's another thing about all these games and all these things that we see that are desensitizing us to all this sin. Look at Job chapter 24 and look at verse number 13. Another thing to notice about these things is the darkness. Look at this. Look at verse 13. Notice how all these video games are played in the dark. Notice how these games are played in the dark. Notice how movies are watched in the dark. Have you ever noticed about this? Look at Job chapter 24 and verse 13. They are those that rebel against the light. They know not the ways thereof, nor abide in the paths thereof. The murderer, rising with the light, killeth the poor and needy, and in the night is as a thief. The eye of the adulterer waiteth for the twilight, saying, no eye shall see me, and disguiseth his face. He's in the dark. In the dark they dig through houses, which they have marked for themselves in the daytime. They know not the light. Now look at this, verse 17. For the morning is to them even as the shadow of death. If one know them, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. You know why these things are all in the dark? Because they want, look, you know what Satan wants? And I'll get to this more in detail, but he wants you to not know the reality around you. He wants to know you the reality that is in front of you. And this is getting much, much worse. The wicked sins in these games, now we enter into role-playing. Now you become the one that is actually doing these things. And now it becomes 10 times worse. I mean, haven't you ever been out soul winning and seen these people that are gaming? I mean, I have met people out soul winning just recently and they come to the door with it. I mean, I don't know how many don't even come to the door because they're busy doing it. But they come to the door and it's like they're mentally disabled. Like you're talking to them and they're just like, I mean, this one guy recently is holding this game controller, just holding there, and he's got like these headphones and all this stuff on his head, and he's just like, no, I'm serious. He's like, he's somewhere else. Oh no, oh, thanks. You know, just making sure it wasn't Amazon is what he was doing, opening the door. He was probably waiting for his new like headset or something. But the point is these people are now living in these games. I talked to an engineer that I worked with about 6 years ago. This is 6 years ago. Like 2015, 2014. And this guy, he'd play this game with all these people all across the world where they were on this island. They were these soldiers on this island, and basically you're on your own on this island, and you just go around on this island just killing people. And I'm like, okay, so what's the point of the game? And he's like, he comes in my office, sits down, and just telling me about like this 4 or 5 hour session that he had in this game. He literally hid behind a bush, and he's like, I planted this mine by this helicopter, and I waited there for 3 hours. And then I got somebody with the booby trap. He literally sat there for 3 hours watching a helicopter in this game, in this virtual island that he's on. And there was all kinds of like monetary things attached to it. I don't know if they were betting with each other or what was going on. But basically like if you got killed or whatever, you lost money somehow. I don't know, like in the real world. But he's just spending, I mean, married, children, the whole thing. The whole thing. So look, the monetary rewards, I mean, he was super stressed about whether or not he would die or whether or not this would work. And I mean, that's the same thing with that Ready Player One game, or that book, is that if you died in the game, you lost everything and had to go work. Now you're a servant of this corporation that invented the game or something. But look, the point is, what's happening today is not that far from this. Now you say, we're just talking about gaming right now. We're not even talking about the metaverse. You say these are just games. Or maybe even I don't even game. We don't do video games in my house. Good for you. Now that you know all of that, the role playing and all of that, let's talk about the metaverse this morning. All that was just introduction. Enter social media. Who's pushing this metaverse? It's the biggest social media company in the world, Facebook. What they're doing is they're combining the game with real life, is what they're going to do. Now, with everything that I have told you about the desensitizing to sin, the playing and toying with witchcraft, look, folks, witchcraft and the demonic forces of this world, that stuff is real. That stuff is real. So if we can get people to think it's a game, if we can get kids to think it's a game, they'll play with these things, they'll think it's a game, but guess what? Demons are real. Satan is on this earth walking around. It's not fake. This stuff is real. And here's the thing. Satan wants you to commit suicide. You're like, I'm saved. Satan wants you, saved or unsaved, Satan would love if you killed yourself. Why? As a saved person, you're completely ineffective if you're dead. As an unsaved person, you're going to go to the same hell as he is, and that's what he wants. He wants to drag everybody to hell with him. So what they are going to do with this metaverse is they're going to combine the virtual world, and they're going to combine all the aspects of gaming and role-playing, and they're going to combine it with real life. That's what they're going to do. And guess what? You mark my words. Number one, it'll work. Number two, all the aspects of sin will come with it. All the virtual sin, all the virtual perversion and promiscuity will come with it. It's already happening. There's already so much virtual perversion and promiscuity that you can see it in the statistics of young men who have the desire for an actual relationship with a woman. It's declining. In Japan, there's all these women, all these young ladies they can't even find a partner or a husband or a boyfriend or anything because none of these young men have any desire for women. It's all virtual for them. The virtual violence will come with it. Life will mean nothing in the metaverse. Die, reset. Look, we're already seeing, you say, that social media, really? We're already seeing increased aggression on social media. Are you kidding me? People will say anything behind a keyboard. Look at the nastiness on social media. People would never say that stuff to your face. I miss the days where you could say to a guy, say that to my face. And then if he did, you go in the park and work it out. That's real. That's real. On social media, all these anonymous personalities out there, it's just nastiness. People doing actual harm to one another, by the way. That they would never do or say to people's faces. Look, it's easier to get behind a keyboard. Look, we were even going to pizza a couple years ago, and I was pulling into the parking lot, and some kid, like I took a left turn, and some kid didn't like it, and he was in his car, and he's all like, in his car. And then I get out of the car, and I'm walking into the pizza place, and he's going to the same pizza place, and he's now walking on the street. And he's like, oh, sorry, sir. He's like, let me get the door for you. But in his car, look, it's much worse behind a keyboard, behind a screen. Look, it's just people will be much more aggressive and much more violent when they would never be that way in person. Because it's easier. It's easier to darken your understanding. It's easier to move past feeling when you're behind a keyboard, behind a virtual personality. That's where we're going with this. And look, the metaverse will amplify this. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. The more virtual real life gets, the worse all this is going to get that I'm telling you about this morning. I mean, you think, how about virtual magic and witchcraft and all those things? You think that the metaverse is going to follow all the physics of the real world that we live in? No. You're going to be able, of course, because you're going to be able to have more powers and abilities. You'll be able to create a godlike character in the metaverse. And look, it will not be God's world. Now go back to Isaiah 14. Go back to Isaiah 14. You know why I know it won't be God's world? Because God's already created His world. God's already created His world. It's the one we're standing in this morning. Go to Isaiah 14. I know that this will be Satan behind it, and here's how I know. Here's how I know that this will happen, again, to recap, because it's possible and people will beg for it. People are already living on Facebook. Social media of all types. Hours a day, even Christians. Look, we see preaching against gaming, but many Christians are completely hooked on this social media stuff. You will never convince me that Facebook is not evil to the core. Never. And guess what? They just keep proving me right again and again. You say, but I just chat with friends. You know what? Send them a text. Send them an email. Here's a better one. Call them. Here's a better one. Visit them. Go actually talk to somebody face to face. Look, it's a whole sermon series in itself. We will never have a Facebook account or page here. Amen. Ever. Amen. Social media in general, even YouTube, the reason that we don't have comments on YouTube, because it's like, hey, if people want to watch sermons, great, fine. You know what? I don't want to get in dialogue. I don't want to get in dialogue, because guess what? You want dialogue with your Christian brothers and sisters? Get in church. Amen. Get in church. That is where it goes wrong, in my opinion. Get in a local church. Getting on YouTube or Facebook and arguing with people who aren't even saved or, where's the separation? Now's where I really convince you. Are you at Isaiah 14? The metaverse. Look at verse 12. This is talking about Lucifer. This is talking about Satan right here. What is Satan's desire? What makes Satan get up in the morning? Why does he do what he does? It's right here. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? No, so Satan being cut down to the ground, Satan being on earth, it weakens the nations. For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation. And here's the big one in verse 14. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. Satan wants to be like God. That is what drives him. This metaverse will be Satan's world. Amen. But what will actually happen? He'll be brought down to hell. That's what will actually happen. Look, folks, the application of this is that you must stay in the world that God created. Amen. You say, why? You say, what's the big deal? Because if you don't, you probably never get saved, first of all. Because that knock on the door, you're probably not ever going to answer the door. Or when you come to the door, you're going to be in a coma. When we knock on your door. You put on that headset, you have no interest in real life or what's happening around you. Look, at best, this virtual world will make people completely uninterested in the real one. That's at best. At worst, it will drag people into a black hole of sin. It will involve people in the demonic forces of this world, Satan's world. It'll drag them into the occult. That's what you saw happen in the 80s. How much of it is happening today with all this stuff? And to the social mediaites out there that are spending all their time on social media, that are like, oh, it's harmless. You know what I got to ask you? Where are your kids? Probably don't know. Are they getting an education? I mean, look, women seem to have the biggest issue with social media, especially in the circles we run in. Women and unemployed men. Those are the two. But where are your kids? What are they doing? Are they getting an education? Or worse, are they on a PC on the other side of the house? Sins of the father. Don't forget that. Just ask yourself, folks, what good is coming of this? What good will come of this metaverse? Ask yourself, do my kids go out and visit the real world? I mean, do your kids exercise? Do they hike? I used to tell the kids when we were growing up, or when the kids were growing up on the farm, I used to tell them, you know why people in the city don't believe in God? Is because they're surrounded by things man-made. And the reason that people in the country believe in God in a much higher percentage is because you're surrounded by God's creation. You're watching, nature around you. You're watching animals be born and grow. Do your kids know how to throw a ball? Do your kids know how to shoot a gun? This is why hunting, fishing, and camping, and hiking, it's all so great, because you're spending time, you're operating in God's world. You're appreciating His creation, which in Romans 1 is one of the two things listed of how we can all see God around us. These are invaluable lessons that your kids need to grow up with. That Christians need to turn off the screens. Because it only gets worse. And if you have a problem now, just wait a few years. But the point is, this metaverse, what it's going to do is it's going to take the physical world and it's going to take the virtual world and it's going to blur it. It's going to blur it. Coronavirus put the gas pedal on this. By the way, this is one of the major, things that pops up in my head is now everyone's virtual. The people I work with, I don't even know where most of them are. I don't know where most of them physically reside. Everyone now is virtual. None of this is going in a good place. Because the more people get detached from reality in general, the more the kingdom of God on earth will suffer. You say, how can you say that? Here's how I can say that, because I know something about every single person on earth. Let me tell you what that is. Every single person on earth, if they don't realize that they're a sinner, if they don't realize that the punishment for their sin is an eternity in hell, if they don't realize that, if they don't realize that God sent His own Son to take the punishment for that sin, and He died on the cross and was buried and rose again on the third day, and if they don't completely put all their trust of their salvation in what God did, what Jesus did on the cross, here's what I know about every single person on the face of the earth that has ever lived. They're going to spend an eternity in literal hell. That's what I know about every single person on earth. Sounds to me like you want to pay attention to what's real. Sounds to me, look, the Christian not operating in the real world is not going to care about the gospel of the real world. Someone wrapped up in sin is going to get somebody knocking on their door and they're just not going to care. They're not going to care about what you have to say to them from the Bible. Someone operating or living in a virtual world will have no interest in what the real world has to say. But the point is, here's what I know. If they die without completely trusting on Christ, they are going to real, literal hell. It's not a cartoon. That's real, folks, whether you like it or not. The Bible says every knee shall bow. That's a complete word right there. Every knee shall bow. The metaverse, wrapping things up. We went out to eat last night. I took my family out to Outback, and not one time did I have the desire to take a picture of my food and post it somewhere. You know what I was doing? I was spending real time with my real family that was really in front of me. That's what I was doing. Yet we sat there, and my wife and a couple of the kids pointed out that every single person, or many people, that walked in, and you look around, and people are walking in with their kids, and their kids are all, they got a phone or they got a screen. And guess what? Yes, same thing. Same thing. You look at two people at dinner together. You ever seen this one? Two people at dinner together with each other, and they're both on their phone. Guess what? They're not really there. They're not really there, but guess what? The reason that this metaverse is going to be so successful, folks, first of all, let me just tell you, it's already here. That's the revelation of the metaverse. It's not only possible, it's here already. These kids in that restaurant, as they walk in, look, their parents, they gave them those devices because that's the easy way. Oh, they can stick their face in here and it's fine. Those kids aren't there. It's easier to jump into a virtual life. It's hard to discipline your children. It's hard to raise them correctly. It's hard to teach them the Bible. Put this in front of your face, and they shut up, and I can enjoy myself at dinner. And then I can be on my phone, and my wife can have some time to be on her phone. It's easier to jump into this virtual life than getting yours together. It's easier. Look, you ever notice that the people on Facebook are picture perfect? Let me tell you what, they're a mess. It's been exposed several times where, look at the big news story that came up. All these social influencers or whatever they talk about, or even all these people that are on, like some guy that murders his wife, and they're just, on Facebook, they just had this perfect life. The more, it's all fake. It's not real. It's virtual. Someone gets murdered and you're like, oh, everyone's all surprised. I'm not surprised because that's not real. This is real. Look, here's the thing, folks. Operate in God's world, and the Bible, because the Bible, you know what the Bible does? It fixes real issues. The Bible fixes real issues. On the contrary, the metaverse will take virtual issues and make them real in your life. Ignore your kids. Spend all your time on social media. When the metaverse gets bigger and more robust, spend more time in these games. Spend more time in all this virtual world and see what happens to your children. Those issues, while you may be shutting them off because you think that the metaverse fixes them, they're going to become very real to you. They're going to become very real to your children. It's not God's world. And yeah, it's coming. It's coming. And we will see it. Stay away from it. Let's bow our heads and have a word of prayer.